My name's Yogen Dalal. That's Yogen Dalal. I was one of VinServe's first graduate students in 1973 when we started taking the work that he and Bob Kahn had developed and formulating it into a protocol specification that could actually be implemented by different computers around the world. So in that particular process, we tried to hammer out the specific details of how would this system actually work. And as I'd mentioned earlier, we had our first two implementations working between the labs at Stanford and the lab at BBN in Boston. And we discovered that there was a slight flaw in the protocol having to do with the robustness, and that led to what we call the three-way handshake in order to ensure that the two computers at both ends were in sync with each other, if that's how you might want to describe it. But in those days, we didn't have simulators. You couldn't simulate thousands of packets going back and forth, even though there were computers. So we clearly had theoretical models to do that, but our simulator was little pieces of paper that represented the packets, and we'd sit around the table with Vint, Carl Sunshine, Dick Karp, myself and others, and we'd put little numbers on these pieces of papers representing what kind of communication would go there, and we would throw these pieces of paper at each other, and every now and then somebody would grab one and remove it to make sure that if some data was lost, that the system could actually recover. Now, I don't want to say that TCP's theoretical foundation was based on little pieces of paper going back and forth, but this was an experiment to verify that the theoretical underpinnings that we had developed actually worked in practice. So that's one of those little sort of stories about how some of the proof points on developing the spec. So, and I, in addition to having written a fair amount in the spec, as Vint indicated in the presentation, I was the final scribe, if you will, where I took his comments, Carl Sunshine's notes, mine, and I typed them in. And it sounds very boring, but it was very exciting because you were using some of the most sophisticated word processing tools of that particular time. So, as various people in the Valley are fond of saying, the journey was as much as the reward as the final production that we did. So my role was really in getting that December 74 spec, RFC 675 in week 72 developed, and then on leaving and going to Xerox some years later, we tried to provide Vint and the TCP group with feedback on how such an internet working protocol might be developed that included not hundreds of computers, but thousands of computers and thousands of networks. And in many ways, that particular piece of input that we provided really enabled the internet to grow. It was about that time that the IBM PC was coming on board, Ethernet controllers were being developed, so the world moved from Unix to the IBM PC connected to the Ethernet. And so somewhere in the early mid-80s, Internet went from being a tool that researchers used, using Sun workstations and large time-sharing systems, to where the commercial world started using it for electronic mail, and the government in particular picked it up. So it's a very exciting journey. I sort of feel fortunate that not only was I involved with TCP, I was involved with Ethernet, and then the bridge between the two. So I find myself at a unique place in time. Thank you.
Besides throwing pieces of paper at each other, do you have any anecdotes involving Vint that you remember during the early 70s or mid-70s?
Oh yeah. So one of my favorite stories about Vint is that Vint likes to keep going. When he finds a problem, he just keeps at it. So we were having some trouble one evening figuring out how to get the implementation work. So we pulled the proverbial all-nighter, and then we hadn't quite finished. It was 6 in the morning, or maybe even a little earlier, maybe 5 in the morning. And Vin said, well, let's go to my house to get a quick cup of coffee and some breakfast, and we'll come back. So we jumped into his car, screeching through Stanford, going through every single stop sign there was, until a Stanford police officer stopped us. Of course, there wasn't a car on the road. She came to Vin's side and said, do you know what you just did? And he looked at her and said, I think so. And then he pulled out his professor card. And she looked at him and said, just don't do that again. But I think what that story really, to me, is that Vint has this unique ability to keep moving, keep going until you find a solution, whether it's an all-nighter or many of the other wonderful things that he's done.